Why Sweden's Air Force scares Putin. Det ska vi reagera på idag. Jag heter Max Villman, tidigare stridspilot på Gripen, och nu kör vi. Ja, den här videon kom ut på The Military Show som har massor med subs, så jag antar att det är många som tittar på det. Och den heter då Why Sweden's Air Force scares Putin. Så vi hoppar in och tittar på vad det handlar om egentligen.
Preparing for war mentally, many were left wondering the same thing. Why would a country that didn't fight at all in the world wars and who hasn't fought in more than 200 years suddenly announce that they need to be ready for war? This statement has sparked a lot of controversies, with people asking questions like, is it because Sweden realized its intention to join NATO? Is it because Russia invaded Ukraine? Will Russia invade Sweden? All these might be true, or it might be that even though Vladimir Putin might be considering invading Sweden as part of his grand plans, the real reason is that he's scared of Sweden, more specifically of the JAS 39 Gripen.
All right.
Today we'll take a look at why the supersonic JAS 39 Gripen makes Sweden's air force so powerful, and the reason why it might make Putin think twice before finally deciding to invade. But before we get to that, just why are the politics of the Baltic region and NATO so important? Many will have heard of the Baltic region, but if you haven't, well, it's the region of countries that surrounds the Baltic Sea, which includes Russia, Finland, Denmark, Estonia, Germany, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Sweden. All these countries had been coexisting relatively peacefully until Russia realized that all the other countries in the Baltic region had joined NATO.
Ja. Coexisting relatively peacefully. Invaderade Finland 1939, Polen 1939, ockuperade de baltiska staterna fram till 90-talet. Ja. Coexisting relatively peacefully. Ja, skulle jag säga.
A fact that doesn't sit well with Russia and was one of the reasons for its invasion of Ukraine. NATO and Russia have a long history dating back to the period after World War II, when Russia was still part of the USSR. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed in 1949 by the USA, Canada, and many Western European nations, with a primary aim to provide security against the USSR. Ever since its creation, there has been a Cold War between NATO and the USSR for dominance. With the USSR's dissolution in 1991, the tension in Eastern and Western Europe was supposed to stop, but Russia just continued where the USSR left off. However, there have been a couple of treaties between NATO and Russia, including the Founding Act in 1997, which improved the partnership between Russia and NATO. Even though it never became a part of NATO, Russia had permanent residence and access to NATO's headquarters in Brussels. However, this relationship completely broke down when Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. Ever since,
ja, och man invaderade Georgien 2008 också, så att, ja.
There has been no conciliation between NATO and Russia, but there was the implied agreement that NATO would keep its Cold War policies in as much as Russia keeps its army and troops in Eastern Europe. However, although NATO has not moved in physical might, they have been expanding their influence towards Eastern Europe.
Det är det här narrativet som Putin presenterade i den här intervjun med Tucker Carlson också. Att de har gjort massor med försök att deeskalera och bla 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 och bla bla bla. Och ja, man måste ju börja med att analysera varför vill länder gå med i NATO från första början. Jo, det är ju för att man inte vill hamna i krig med Ryssland. Det är därför man går med i NATO. Så att hade Ryssland haft andra ambitioner och en annan nivå på sin, det de vill, då hade inte några länder fler känt sig tvingade att ansöka till NATO.
Which is what Putin doesn't like. And that was one of the things he mentioned before going into Ukraine. If Ukraine joins NATO and decides to take Crimea back through military means, European countries will automatically get drawn into a military conflict with Russia. And now, a similar thing is happening again, but this time not with the land borders of Russia, but the maritime border in the Baltic region. All of the countries there are now part of NATO, with Sweden being the most recent to join. So what's the current relationship between Sweden and Russia? While we can say that joining NATO has unequivocally created more tension between the countries, the two have not exactly been friends for some time. Back in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the EU placed sanctions on Russia, and Sweden voted for them. In retaliation, Russia added all countries in the EU to their list of unfriendly nations. In response, Sweden and many of the countries in turn labeled Russia persona non grata. But the animosity between the two
Alltså persona non grata är ju någonting man ger till enskilda diplomatiska medlemmar på ett konsulat eller en ambassad. Det vill säga ambassadörer och andra diplomater. De är ju skyddade när de är i andra länder på ambassaden, så de är skyddade med diplomatpass. Det vill säga att de får egentligen inte hanteras av det respektive landets säkerhetstjänst eller polis. Det vill säga att en svensk polis har inte rätt att göra vad de vill legalt, arrestera till exempel ryska diplomater. Men har man då diplomater som missköter sig så kan man förklara dem persona non grata, och då får de inte längre ha ett diplomatvisum, diplomatpass i Sverige då till exempel. Så blir du tagen för spioneri, alltså som diplomat i Sverige, en rysk diplomat, då kommer du att förklaras persona non grata och skickas tillbaka till Ryssland. Du har inte rätt att upprätthålla dig i Sverige med den här diplomatiska immuniteten mer. Så att jag vet inte riktigt vad det är de pratar om här.
Two countries began long before 2022. The two countries have a long history of conflicts, dating back centuries, including the Finnish War, where in 1809 Russia took control of Finland from Sweden. During World
Ja, och om man ska vara helt ärlig så hade vi ju betydligt mer än det här. Den här gränsen är jag inte riktigt säker på var den kommer ifrån.
War II, Sweden had proclaimed neutrality, but it still borrowed some planes from Finland when Russia, then the Soviet Union, invaded it. Even though Sweden was...
Ja, och frivilliga soldater och vapen och massor av annan hjälp.
Neutral in the...
Och vi hade inte förklarat oss neutrala i kriget mellan Finland och Sovjetunionen, utan förklarar oss icke-krigförande.
War. It had a pact with the US that in a situation where the Soviet Union tried to invade Sweden, the US would come to Sweden's defense. But that...
Ja, exakt hur det där såg ut är inte heller offentligt, om man ska vara helt ärlig. Men man får ju anta att det fanns vissa planer att hjälpa varandra, men det fanns ju inget officiellt bilateralt försvarspakt.
Never happened. Also, there is the incident of the Soviet Union shooting down two jets that belonged to Sweden in the 1950s.
Alltså jag vet inte om jag kan kolla mer på den här filmen. Det är så mycket fel. De här, om vi tar DC3, Katalinan, allt det här, det var ju alltså i Östersjön, inte över utanför Kolahalvön. 121 000 views på 4 dagar. 121 000 views på 4 dagar. Är det jag ska göra? Ska jag köra massa faktafel istället och bara spy ut massa skit? Så kommer ni titta.
One belonging to the Swedish government and one to a civilian. But it didn't stop there. In 1981, Sweden discovered a Soviet Union Whiskey-class submarine in its waters, and it took up to 10 days before a diplomatic agreement that returned that submarine to the Soviet Union could be reached. All these point to the fact that both Sweden and Russia have had it back and forth with each other, so there is definitely an historical precedent if another attack on Sweden is suggested. And with Russia invading Ukraine, the idea is not far-fetched. But should Sweden actually be expecting an invasion? Ever since the invasion of Ukraine, the countries surrounding Russia have unsurprisingly started spending heavily on their militaries. Most neighboring countries to Russia like Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, who were formerly under the USSR, just like Ukraine, believe there is a possibility that Russia could invade them in the future, just like they did Ukraine. These countries are relatively small, but even Poland, a relatively large country neighboring Russia and Ukraine, is also unnerved by Russia's erratic actions and is strengthening their military might. Also, these countries are members of NATO, which means in Putin's head, they are threats to the security of Russia. These countries will take their military strength seriously if Russia decides to come at them. There's even a prediction from Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, who said that NATO should be prepared to face Russia in 3 to 5 years. Even though Sweden doesn't have a land border with Russia, the maritime border they share, and Russia's behavior in the past have prompted Sweden to strengthen their military might as well. This was evident in the information the Swedish government passed out in 2022 about increasing military spending to 2% of the country's GDP. As explained by the Swedish defense minister, the reason for this is that the country is facing the most serious security policy situation since the end of World War II. As of 2024, the defense bill was drafted in which 2% of the country's GDP would go to military spending, a whopping 27 billion krona, equivalent to 2.3.
Ja, försvarsberedningen har föreslagit 2,61% av BNP för hela försvaret, totalförsvaret då.
Billion US dollars. This money is supposed to go toward their NATO membership payment and developing the military, especially their air force, which is one of the reasons why Putin will need to be careful.
Och framförallt så har man ju lagt mer pengar på armén i de senaste försvarsberedningarna relativt sett.
Before thinking about invading. Which brings us to the real reason why Putin should be scared of Sweden, or more specifically, its air force. Since Sweden hasn't been involved in a war in a very long time, many people don't know about the country's true military might, especially what they can do in the air. The Swedish Air Force, or SWAF, was created in 1926, and even though this arm of the military did not have the chance to perform during the Second World War due to the country's neutrality, they are extremely effective, both on paper and in reality. The real beginning of the strength of the Swedish Air Force stems back to when the country decided to heavily invest into nuclear weapons research. It may not seem like this would lead to a powerful air force, but stay with us. Faced with the hostile presence the Soviet Union posed after World War II, and to protect themselves from likely future assault, Sweden, under the guise of civilian defense, started researching their own nuclear weapons.
Ja, jag skulle inte säga att det har någonting med Flygvapnet att göra. Visst, Lansen skulle kunna bära då taktiska kärnvapen till exempel, bandkanonen skulle kunna skjuta det och så vidare och så vidare. Men att vi vill ha ett starkt flygvapen var ju för att vi vill ha ett starkt jaktskydd. Vi vill kunna genomföra offensiva operationer också och så vidare och skjuta sönder landstigningsföretag från Warszawapakten och Ryssland. Och då vill vi ha ett starkt flygvapen med mycket jakt, mycket spaning och E1 då är skaderätt som skulle kunna slå på den här sjömålsoperationen som de skulle behöva genomföra för att komma hit och även kunna understödja upp i norr då med bombflyg. Så jag vet inte riktigt kopplingen mellan kärnvapnen och flygvapnet där om jag ska vara helt ärlig.
The project was fairly successful and progressed to the stage where underground testing was possible, but the Riksdag, Sweden's supreme decision-making body, decided that the exploration of nuclear energy shouldn't be used to build weapons, but instead to create a defense against nuclear attacks. And this is what would lead to a more powerful air force, as much of the money that had been pouring into developing nuclear weapons was now diverted to the air force.
Ja, som sagt, ni får gärna komma med någon faktakälla på det i kommentarerna här, men jag känner inte till att det har någonting med varandra.
Beginning of investment that surged Sweden forward and placed them among the countries with the best air forces in the world. Around that time in the 1950s, the Air Force then decided to use the large funding to start the creation of their domestic aircraft. As a result of all the money well spent, during the Cold War, Sweden became the world's fourth most powerful air force with about 1,000 modern planes, which introduced the Saab A-32 Lansen, Saab J-29 Tunnan, and the Saab J-35 Draken, and that was just the beginning. Now, thanks to that lineage, Sweden has created arguably one of the best fighter jets in the world, the single-engine supersonic multi-role fighter jet JAS-39 Gripen. When the prototype was demonstrated in 2009, the fighter jet reached the supersonic speed of Mach 1.2, or around 913 miles per hour. And it did this without the use of an afterburner, making it better for higher range and giving it fuel-saving advantages. The Gripen has several variants, including the Gripen JAS-39C and D, as well as the JAS-E and F. The only difference between the C and D is that the C is a single-seater, while the D has room for two, same for the E and F. And even though the C, D, and EF are fairly similar, the EF is the newer, updated version. Both have features that would make anyone think twice before getting into an aerial battle with Sweden, even Putin. The Gripen JAS-39CD is powered by a Volvo RM12 engine with an afterburner capable of reaching speeds of Mach 2 and can operate at heights over 49,000 feet or 15,000 meters without issue. Although it's equipped with sophisticated avionics, it's
Det där är en Erik, det där är inte en C. Det ser vi på att de bär 4 stycken Robot 15. Det kan inte C göra. Vi ser också det på IRST här.
the Gripen's arsenal that truly gives it an edge over its rivals, thanks to a 27mm cannon.
Sen ska ju Erik ha ju bara ett framhjul, inte två.
And 8 hardpoints for missiles and bombs, which means it can both win duels in the air and destroy targets on the ground. The Gripen JAS-39EF, which is the newer version, is an even more dangerous multi-role combat aircraft that's capable of air fighting and ground-based air attack missions, thanks to its increased payload, longer range, and more advanced electronic warfare capabilities. It also has a more powerful engine, the General Electric F414 GE39, which also has a top speed of Mach 2, but a higher operational ceiling of 52,000 feet, or 16,000 meters. Having such a powerhouse in the sky makes one thing very certain: no one would want to mess with them. Putin is even one of the few world leaders who should want to engage in an aerial battle with Sweden. Even though Russia is one of the top 3 air forces in the world on paper, they are facing a lot of trouble converting those stats into real-life results. This was made evident very quickly when Russia invaded Ukraine, and Russia's supersonic fighter jets like the Su-34 and Su-57 that were supposed to dominate the Ukrainian
Mig veterligen så har inte Su-57 använts i kriget med Ukraina, men det kanske den har någonstans. Jag har inte sett någonting, men ni, om sagt, kommentera gärna om ni har sett någon sån källa.
in airspace started to fall to manpad-launched surface-to-air missiles. Many of Russia's fighter jets were seen running from the battlefield, and some pilots even abandoned their jets because they weren't effective enough.
Ja. Det här är en riktig jävla skitfilm alltså. Hur kan 846 000 människor prenumerera på den här kanalen och 121 000 har tittat på den här videon på 4 dagar? Jag vet inte. Jag stannar där. Tack för att ni stannar hela vägen hit. Ni får hoppa över på den där hemsidan och klicka på den filmen om ni vill titta på den. Jag tycker inte ni behöver göra det, men om ni vill det så gå in på The Military Show och titta på den. Som sagt, tack för att ni tittade hela vägen hit. Glöm inte att gilla videon på vägen upp och prenumerera på kanalen också. Och vill ni stötta kanalen ekonomiskt, som sagt, jättegärna en Swish på numret nere i beskrivningen eller överväga att bli kanalmedlemmar. Det är ni som gör det här möjligt. Ni kan också köpa lite snygg merch på nixg.se. Och är du en ledare eller du jobbar på ett företag som behöver hjälp med en inspirationsföreläsning, så kan ni också boka ett kostnadsfritt konsultationssamtal med mig, så ser vi om vi är en bra match att arbeta med varandra. Som sagt, tack för att ni tittade hela vägen på den här riktigt kassa videon från The Military Show, och till nästa gång som vanligt så fly safe.